All right, perfect. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. My name is Benning Johnson, and I will be presenting about emergency medical services, also known as EMS. The first thing you learn in EMT school is the importance of PPE, more specifically for EMS providers in the form of gloves. Gloves contact hundreds of thousands of patients nationwide every day, and today we'll be taking a look under these gloves to see how EMS can be improved for all. So today's plan, we will first look at the history of EMS, then dive into its structure and logistics, then how that leads to its inaccessibility and its issues, and possible solutions. A quick note about my interest in this topic. This past summer, I spent 3 months studying to get my EMT certification. It was certainly a difficult and long process, but 100% worth it, and a career I see myself in the very near future. So this leads us to our essential question. EMS is an undoubtedly essential service for all Americans, yet it is a public health crisis. What causes EMS's issues, and how can its effectiveness and efficiency be improved? Let's start by looking at the history of care in a pre-hospital setting. This can be traced back to the Civil War or earlier, but EMS as we know today originated from a report that landed on Lyndon B. Johnson's desk in 1966. The report from the National Academy of the Sciences outlined America's neglected disease, accidental traumatic injury. The report, nicknamed the White Papers, aimed to create a standardized, nationally recognized curriculum to manage traumatic accidents and events. It also led to the implementation of EMS education to train community members to respond to such events. While the report originally only covered traumatic injuries, the EMS system, as we know today, responds to both medical and traumatic emergencies. Lyndon B. Johnson approved the implementation of the White Papers, and EMS was born. In 1967, Dr. Peter Safar of the University of Pittsburgh was key in implementing pre-hospital care to underserved communities. This would eventually lead to the expansion of EMS throughout the country. Peter Safar is widely known to be the father of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, also known as CPR, the head tilt shin lift maneuver, the jaw thrust maneuver, and airway ventilations. These interventions are a key step in saving lives. Peter Safar demonstrated the effectiveness that a medical professional could have in an emergency and how to save lives. Safar's developments were later adopted by the American Heart Association, and across the globe, over 22 million people are taught CPR each year. Peter Safar later received funds from the United States Department of Transportation to create a nationwide EMS system. With this was the birth of Freedom House Ambulance Service. Soon after, Dr. Nancy Caroline, also of the University of Pittsburgh, was brought in as the service's medical director. Caroline not only reorganized the financial and administrative side of the organization, but she also trained the first paramedics to ever ride on an ambulance. Before Freedom House, segregated neighborhoods such as the Hill District in Pittsburgh, Freedom House's home, received little to no emergency response. Previously, either a police car fitted for the patient or a hearse would pick up patients in an emergency. Unfortunately for the patient, but convenient for the mortician, an unlucky patient would ultimately not leave the hearse. Additionally, almost all of Freedom House's providers were people of color. Diana Sashin of Stanford Medicine states, quote, "A poor black man from one of Pittsburgh's inner city neighborhoods was now trained to provide advanced cardiac life support." Freedom House provided underserved communities with essential emergency care and was a pioneer in accessible EMS. While no longer in service today, Freedom House Ambulance left a lasting impact on how successful EMS should work. From the first 911 call made in 1968 to the roughly 600,000 calls made every day, the EMS system never sleeps. However, Americans are dying from the disorganization of the EMS system. Dr. Robert E. O'Connor of the University of Virginia states that, quote, "If you've seen one EMS system, you've seen exactly one EMS system." Dr. O'Connor is right. There are no two identical EMS systems, and this is what leads to much of its issues. For practical purposes today, there are 4 different ways to run an ambulance. The first type is a private ambulance. In most cases, private ambulances do not respond to 911 emergency calls. They'll instead perform interfacility transfers from a nursing home to a dialysis center, etc. However, there are numerous cases in which private ambulances do have the primary emergency response duty. The city of Brookline, Massachusetts has a contract with Fallon Ambulance Service to provide its primary emergency response 911. The city of East Hampton, Massachusetts runs its EMS through the fire department. The city of Boston EMS runs its EMS through a separate municipal department, Boston EMS. Similar to East Hampton, Massachusetts, yet slightly different, New York City runs its EMS through through the fire department, but 30% of its 911 response ambulances are hospital-based ambulances under contract with the fire department. So to summarize, private, fire department, municipal, and hospital-based ambulances all have different responsibilities and designations depending on local governments. Confusing, right? To make things even more confusing, there is no central office or administration that governs EMS in the United States. It is instead controlled by an uncoordinated combination of the U.S. Fire Administration and Department of Transportation. Under federal rule right now, EMS is not considered an essential service in the U.S. like police and fire is. Without a formal administration, EMS cannot properly function. Because of EMS's confusing structure, an already insane world of medical bills becomes even more confusing when EMS rides are thrown into the mix. With a variety of different ambulances that could respond to your emergency, there is an even greater variety of bills you could receive. Some EMS services are included in insurance plans while others are not. In 2018, a Boston woman tripped while getting off the subway and got her leg stuck in between the train and the platform. While stuck, she begged for people to not call an ambulance. Ultimately, an ambulance did arrive and she did receive proper emergency care. However, no person should have to refuse or avoid medical care in an emergency because they fear they can't afford it. No person should have to refuse or avoid medical care in an emergency because they fear they can't afford it. In La Jolla, California, a woman swam into the side of a pool breaking 3 teeth. Another swimmer called an ambulance for her non-emergent injury, where EMS providers applied a neck brace as a precaution. For the neck brace and 10-minute ambulance ride, she was billed more than $1,700. For EMS to better serve its people, there must be consistency, transparency, and a fair pricing system. COVID-19 has had a permanent impact on EMS and has exposed many of its issues. It has also been key in providing us with a view into its many weaknesses. It has had a profound impact on the mental health of EMS providers. During COVID, EMS providers in the city of New York had a risk of dying 14 times that of New York City firefighters. EMT Jennifer Murphy of New York told the New York Times that, quote, "That deep cough we once heard when we arrived on the scene was replaced by the agonized wails of inconsolable family members. A father or a mother or a grandparent had just died, and all we could do was stand there," end quote. COVID has played a major role in the effectiveness of EMS in exposing its weaknesses. EMS is an incredibly difficult industry to work in. Providers respond to traumatic emergencies, witness death, injury, and sickness to patients of all ages, work long hours, and for pay less than that of a weather-vane dishwasher in many places. There's little surprise that EMS providers have a suicide rate significantly higher than the general public. In order for EMS to work for the American people, it must first work for its providers. New York EMT Jennifer Murphy, mentioned earlier, states that improving EMS is, quote, "not a war that can be fought only by brave frontline heroes. It is a public health crisis that the public must be made aware of." So what can be done? Firstly, the public must be made aware of its issues. Then, a separate administration for emergency medical services in the United States must be put in place. As I mentioned earlier, EMS is not currently considered an essential service, and this has to change. Through the new administration, private ambulances should not be used for 911 emergency response. EMS must be a service provided to the American people, not a business. 911 emergency ambulances should be run by the government as municipal or fire department ambulances. With a centralized administration and more logical format, the finances of EMS will be easier to understand and easier to control, allowing EMS to be more accessible for all. Lastly, providers must be compensated appropriately as they are on the front lines of this crisis. This does not only have to come in the form of better pay and steady benefits, but also as mental health counseling, support, and resources. If the EMS system is improved, it can grant the right of essential emergency care for all Americans. Thank you. Any questions? Mr. Johnson?
So, you said it's not considered essential. Does that mean that your cities or towns have no legal obligation to even have EMS service? Like, I guess is there an option to just opt out if they can't afford it? I'm just wondering.
For some towns, such as Brookline, Massachusetts, don't offer EMS response under their government. They contract it out to private companies. But yes, under federal rule right now, it's not considered essential. So potentially you could have places in which there is no emergency response, especially like in Wyoming, there's towns that have no, Wyoming, Montana, there are cases where towns have no ambulance response under like 30 minutes. So a lot of towns will have mutual aid with other towns if they don't have an EMS service, and that really only happens in rural areas. But most towns tend to provide EMS as it should be an essential service, and it would make sense to be. Mr. Hanford?
Do you want to see this at the state kind of jurisdiction and the state level, in the national level, and where is it right now? Where is that?
Sure. So right now, under federal rule, it's not an essential service. So I think it needs to be put in place on the federal level. I think Congress needs to make changes there. Right now, police and fire are considered essential, and so I think Congress needs to make rules to stop private ambulances from responding, because that contributes to a lot of its issues. Private ambulances will often charge, I've seen things up to 10 times what a bill should be because Medicare and insurance won't cover it, and they need to make money somehow. So Congress needs to make rules so that the government is providing people with emergency response.
Where is it at this point?
It's on the federal level right now, it's on the state level right now.
Sorry, are there bills being passed? Are there people pushing for this, or is it just starting?
It's a pretty new concept, and I think a part of that is because of COVID. It's sort of exposed a lot of its issues and its weaknesses. So there's a lot of progress, and right now there's not much in the works to sort of promote its improvement. Jacob?
Have you heard ideas with the talks about like a more socialized healthcare system? Have you heard any talks that would include this in like maybe a more comprehensive like healthcare system? I
definitely have heard of that in a more socialized healthcare system, which I personally think is a good idea and would make sense for EMS at least. It is very tricky because a lot of people will say EMS is usually just a bill that leads up to a bigger bill once you're in the hospital. So a lot of people tend to focus on that. It's usually just a precursor to that larger bill you will receive in the hospital. So a lot of the focus is on in-hospital care, not pre-hospital care, which I think is another big issue. Sage?
So how did your time this summer getting trained and working sort of influence you to write about this? And like, what did you see that made you interested in learning about it?
Yeah, it was a long process this summer to get my certification. It took 3 months and was a lot of hard work. But it's definitely a career I see myself in the near future. I did a few ride-alongs. I haven't been able to yet work on an actual ambulance, which is my goal this summer. But it's sort of just doing these ride-alongs and sort of being part of the EMS curriculum has shown me how important it is and how necessary it is. And then also its downfalls and how it's not considered essential and how there are so many issues to it. Also public health is a big interest of mine. I want to major in that in college. And so this combined a lot of those interests that I have. Sarah?
Is the curriculum different in different states, or is that something that's nationally published?
The curriculum is also different in different states. So I got my EMT certification in the state of New Hampshire, where I could not administer an iGel tube, which is a certain type of airway. But if I had gotten my certification in the state of Massachusetts, I could administer an iGel tube. So it's very confusing on the curriculum level as well, which is therefore just another issue that needs to be fixed, I think, later down the road. Because you could get in an accident in Massachusetts and your treatment would look different than it would in New Hampshire. So that's on the state level for right now. Thank you.
Awesome job. Thank you.